for a second. I don't know. All right. Call the meeting to order. Republic Wastewater Capital Improvements, Phase 2 Wastewater Treatment Plant Expansion. I am excited. I don't know that I've ever had a handout this big before, so I'm really interested in where we're going with this.
It's reflective of the size of the project.
Mr. Nelson, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, everybody, for coming just a little bit early tonight so we can give the proper attention to the next steps that we're about to take.
Just real quick question for Chris. Chris, can you hear him on that mic? Okay, good.
Okay.
So we need to be able to hear him a little bit more. Thanks.
Oh, wow.
Project your voice.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I wanted to take a minute because we're talking about the biggest chunk of where we're going in wastewater to kind of go back through the history for council members that haven't been here for the whole 7 years that we've been kind of working on this, and record it for the residents as it's going to impact the rates potentially, and then for new council members and those that'll be joining the board in April. So just an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. I'll give you just a brief kind of an aerial view of our wastewater system and how it operates. That actually came from a discussion I had with Councilmember Fields that reminded me that not everybody knows what that looks like. Then we're going to go through the history of compliance in wastewater, and it's a pretty lengthy one. The capital improvements that we need to be compliant, the current projects, the funding and the deficit that we have in front of us, the funding that we're looking to secure, timing of the projects, and then we'll end with the proposed rate structure to fund it. This is our wastewater system. It's really small. I have it on the handout, but to see it all in one aerial view, we kind of have to look at it from really high up. But the important thing that I think everyone may or may not understand about Republic wastewater system is that the majority of the city, and from about where my pointer is and everything in here, ends up at the Schuler Creek lift station and then is pumped back to the wastewater treatment plant on the north side of town. And that's what's unique about Republic's wastewater system. It's not uncommon to have lift stations. It is uncommon to collect 90% of your waste and pump it back up to your wastewater treatment plant. That's what makes this system expensive to maintain, expensive to upgrade, and complicated. Just for high level, I mentioned that this is the wastewater treatment plant here, Schuler Creek lift station, McElhaney. We have 2 lift stations in Brookline that are all part of these discussions. Any questions just on like an overview of the system and where everything ends up? Okay, the compliance issue for Republic really goes back as far as I can tell to 1994. And the first issue that the city had was the failure to submit a facility plan and collection system upgrades because they were having overflows due to I&I. We hear that a lot. And they didn't have the adequate capacity to serve the size of city that they had, and they were continuing to grow. So DNR said, you need to come up with a plan to fix this. So the first settlement agreement that they had with DNR came in 1996. They had failed to submit that plan. Then in November, the same year, 1996, they submit a facility plan. And then in 1997, there's 3 revisions to that plan. And I'm going to talk about why, but they've complied with this first settlement agreement by submitting a plan to address these issues. So in 1997, there were 3 public elections on wastewater. And the issue to the citizens was we need to issue bonds in order to fund these improvements that we've proposed to become compliant with MDNR. And the first vote took place in April 11.5 million in bonds, and it had a new treatment plant on the southern edge of the city boundary at the time. It failed, 831 to 659. They went back in August with a little bit slight modification to the plan, and it mainly had to do with capacity, but still with a plant on the south side of town. It failed again in a worse fashion, I guess. And then the passing vote was in November, and it was for 14.3 million in bonds, and the difference was they had created a plan to expand the plant in place and construct the Schuler Creek, what would be the Schuler Creek interceptor and the lift station. So that one passed in excuse me, in November of 97.
I'm sorry, Andrew.
Go ahead.
This is just my curiosity. Can you go back a slide? Did you happen to pull what the city population was back in 1997 to know what percentage of the population turned out to vote for these? Just out of curiosity.
I didn't, but I would tell you if that total number of votes cast is 1,400, that turnout is not that much different than a turnout we see today.
Okay.
For votes that we have. I think we've seen a little bit more than that on some of our larger issues, but on an off election cycle, that's close to a turnout we would have today.
Right.
And so that, in that time frame, that would be a pretty big turnout.
Okay. Thank you.
And likely because these directly impacted rates. The second revision to the settlement agreement that started back in 96 came in 2000, and really the third, I'm going to kind of summarize these two together. There were challenges that the city faced because in the agreement and agreeing to comply, they also agreed not to issue building permits. They also for commercial and residential, and they faced some legal challenges for those because developments were approved and underway, and then all of a sudden there was more or less a moratorium on, hey, we can't obligate you any capacity until we comply with these regulations of DNR. All that to be said, it drug the process out past the compliance dates. So each time they're going back to DNR and saying, hey, we haven't been able to start construction, and we've got different plans. So you're in the early 2000 with a third revised agreement to the issue that started back in 96. So 2002 is a key date. That's when they commissioned the wastewater plant in its current location, expanded with the additional capacity. They had also finished up the construction of the lift station and the interceptor. What's important to note in this juncture in this story is you see March 24th, 2003, they're issued a notice of violation a year later, and it has to do with excess flow exiting the lift stations from I&I. So met the settlement agreement. 1 year later, we're back in trouble. And the same issue happens again in May. The city receives a violation for discharge due to I&I and rainfall at the stormwater clarifier, which is what we call outfall 002. It's at the plant. We get too much water at the plant. We bypass primary treatment and we dump out of the stormwater clarifier. So that's the key component of today's compliance issue. But the first kind of notice of violation at that location reasons about 2003. Another notice of violation in 2007. And then in 2010, this is another key date because this is where DNR says, okay, you can't have that anymore. You need to come up with a plan. Again, this is like, we'll give you time. And this is not also uncommon to Republic. They're issuing this order because of a change in environmental regulation that says you can no longer do these things due to rain. It wasn't uncommon for wastewater treatment plants to bypass in rain events, but in 2010, they say you can't do that anymore. They come up with a process that's called a voluntary compliance agreement. And they say you need to do this. And it's a 5-year compliance timeline, and it's a built-in almost guaranteed 5-year extension. So they start the first 5 years in 2011 to eliminate outfall 002, the stormwater bypass, due to I&I and rain. April 15th, 2016, that first 5 years has gone by. Not a lot of progress in eliminating I&I or the discharges. So the city requests an extension, gets the extension, and then in November 2017, those that were on council that will remember, we commissioned the wastewater master planning effort. And we hired Burns and McDonnell, which has been probably just a really a blessing in their ability to navigate a very complex issue. But the master plans themselves took about 2 years just to find all of the wastewater system, because we didn't have a good inventory of what our wastewater system was. We didn't know where all the manholes were. We didn't know the elevation of all the pipes. And in order to come up with a proper facility plan, you got to have inventory of your facility. So it took about 2 years. We spent $1.5 million. And in May of 2020, the council adopted those master plans, and it included a $150 million CIP program to be compliant. So May of 2020 is like the time frame. It got a little more expensive than the May of 2020 price in about October of 2020. David will remember that, because this is one of those places. But for all intents and purposes, those plans included $150 million of capital improvements. So that second extension ended in 2021. And the one thing that I think the city did that was wisdom was we maintained continuous contact with DNR about our plans, about what we were doing. For the city to take on a master planning effort of $1.5 million with a consulting engineer was more than the city had done, all the way back to '96 as far as planning and investment into the compliance side of it. So they knew where we were going and what we were planning, and the price tag, knowing that you can't deliver that in a short amount of time. So they advised that we enter into an abatement order. And an abatement order is, in our instance, it says on consent, is still voluntary. We asked for it, but it comes with teeth. So there are penalties if we don't meet the April 2025 deadline to eliminate our direct discharge due to stormwater. So it's a little different in those voluntary agreements. Didn't really have a spelled out penalty. This one does have a penalty, and other implications on the next step DNR would take if we don't meet this compliance agreement. Any questions on compliance regulation?
What does that penalty look like?
That is a great question, and I don't have it. It's minimal on a per instance basis. And one thing DNR does, they're not incentivized to collect penalties from municipalities to grow their own revenue. Those funds go to like the local, I think, school district in this case. So it's not that DNR is incentivized to penalize us, but I want to say it's in the $5,000 per instance time frame, and you'll see here in a little bit kind of the frequency of our instances. And one thing I missed in a couple of those amendments to the early settlement agreements, the city did pay fines, and one of those back in 2000 time frame, I think, was 2001. Yeah, they paid $44,000 in civil penalty.
That was for one incident?
Yeah, that's on the third revised agreement. So what they're doing is, hey, we went through one agreement, a second agreement, and now we're in this third agreement. So you're gonna pay a little bit of a fine for getting to this point.
I don't want to ruin the end of your story, but are we looking okay for April 2025?
We're looking really good
Okay.
most of the time.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah, we'll go through that. There's some. I'll try to do my best to talk through water quality and explain instances where that may be trouble, and I'll try to lure David into that discussion a little bit. But when we go into modifying our wastewater treatment plant, it's not just about the AOC now. Because we're changing the way we treat water, we're adding capacity or permitted capacity, saying, hey, we're going to build a plant that may actually discharge more water in the future than we're currently permitted for. It opens the whole permit for review, and we go through a process called anti-degradation. And what they're doing there is they're looking at our permit limits and what we're proposing to do and saying this won't make the environment worse than what you're already doing. They also look at the capacity versus our projected growth and say if you're going to modify, you have to plan for a 20-year growth so that you're not continuously asking for new permitted limits or new actually capacity limits. So part of that review, we had new limits imposed on us. Imposed is probably the right word, maybe given to us, for cyanide and phosphorus. And phosphorus may not mean a lot to everyone, but generally I think we would all agree that introducing cyanide, we can understand, probably not agree that that's not something we should probably put into the environment. I have a note here about mass loading calculations, and I'm going to try to do my best to make this where something everybody can understand. If we discharge 1 million gallons today, and in that 1 million gallons, there's 500 pounds of X. If we ask them to permit us for 3 million gallons, in order to not impact the environment adversely, they're going to say, that's great, but you're still only limited to 500 pounds. So the concentration of what's in the water that we discharge then becomes cleaner. Any questions on that? That's where DNR is going. They're going to, and I forget the rule. It's in the Clean Water Act, the anti-backslide. Gotcha.
Anti-backsliding degradation, yes.
Thank you. So, again, in this process, we have to design and build a facility. If we're going to touch it at all, it has to survive the life of the debt and plan for new regulation. I have a note here that in that anti-degradation review, DNR notes that the MBR, which is membrane bioreactor, which is the type of plant we're building, new technology, not new technology, new for a city to implement as their primary treatment process for wastewater, especially in Missouri. They note that because of the type of water that plant will produce, that this will help us with future water quality requirements. And what that's telling us is you haven't even seen all of the requirements yet that we're going to eventually implement into water quality. This is a good slide, and this is the one I was telling the mayor about. This is all of the action this council has taken since 2017, and then some dates on workshops where myself or Mr. Cameron stood up here and talked about wastewater and these projects. And this is important too because DNR also sees this as progress toward compliance, and it gives you favor when you're negotiating enforcement action. So I just wanted to put that up there and just as a kind of reminder of how long we've been working on this.
Andrew, it's a great point. I also think that slide, because you trigger a thought for me, I think that's what the legislators have seen in Jefferson City when it comes to us receiving the funding and the support that we have, that we've planned for it and figured out a long-range solution, not just a temporary fix. Along with our growth, I think that slide does say a lot.
And I'm probably missing some public hearings and other discussions we had, and it doesn't include anything that we do in budget where we're buying equipment or fixing I&I or things like that. So these are just actions that were brought before the body. So again, to the progress we've made the largest investment into capital improvements in the city's history. We issued $45 million in bonds in 2022. And that funded CIPs 3, 6, 7 and blending, which we'll talk about. We utilized local ARPA dollars that were allocated directly to Republic to do another CIP. We have an I&I reduction program that's ongoing. Since tonight we're talking about SRF funding, I want to point out that in 2022 we went to a privatized bonding, and Bob could speak a little bit to more like the actual nomenclature behind that, but private funding. The interest rates at the time were way more favorable in comparison to the SRF. You'll see that SRF is a really good deal in today's market. But also SRF is an 18-month process. And in the interest of making progress in a short term to meet that compliance agreement, we had to move quick. We didn't have 18 months to line out our funding for these projects. And that funding is key too, because it provided the city local match dollars for those grant funds that David talked about. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but having that in hand saying, hey, we're bringing money to the table made us way more competitive. The effective interest rate on those Series 22 bonds was about 2.6. The master plans had, on the collection side, a list of immediate CIPs that our consultant said, hey, these are projects on the collection side that if you don't address them in short order, could become a problem and create future compliance issues. So we've knocked off a fair amount of those. The I&I program is something that will continue for perpetuity, but we do have targeted areas of I&I remediation that we're working on currently. And a couple of these projects are development driven. So as subdivisions were built, there was issues that were addressed in those developments funded by the development. I popped this back up here just so we can visually see CIPs 6 and 7 was replacement to McElhaney Lift Station. It was about 30 years old. Replaced the force main from McElhaney to our gravity system, and then the entire gravity line from there down to Schuler Creek. That's CIPs 6 and 7, about 15 million in those two. CIP 3 was a much smaller lift station improvement closer to Main Street. There was actually a lift station that was about 500 feet of line to keep it from sending it all the way down to Schuler Creek and just send it straight to the plant. And the lift station needed to be replaced anyway. And it being in the area of our I&I problems warranted that one to get corrected. We've seen this before. We talked about it ad nauseum when we considered the purchase of the vac truck. These are indications of where I&I in the city is the worst. This is where all of our stormwater comes from. And stormwater will always exist getting into the system. We'll never have it all eliminated. Even in our best efforts, we intend to get about 55% of the water that actually enters the system. The blending project is the addressing of outfall 002. And what that does is it introduces some level of treatment to the direct discharge that we were getting in trouble for, and it blends it with our fully treated water. The chart here shows you every time, starting in 2016, and I think it cuts off in 2021, but it shows you every time that we violated the rule that they said you can't do that. And so this is why it's become a very important action for us to take to MDNR. You can see if you trend this, it's generally the rainy season. If you kind of ignore the initial data where we were kind of building out how we monitor flow, if you look at these three rainy seasons, you see a general somewhat increase in I&I. And that has to do with adding, the system getting into worse condition. But as we start to use up capacity in the plant for just primary treatment, we no longer have capacity for the I&I, so we divert more flow to the stormwater bypass. So as that trend continues, we'll continue to discharge more water. This is a cartoon of our wastewater treatment system in its current configuration. This is the stormwater clarifier. This is generally the water quality that comes out of it. This is what comes out of our plant, substantially better. BOD and TSS are biochemical oxygen demand and total suspended solids. BOD, think about it as the amount of oxygen nature has to provide to decompose what's being introduced. So other sources of BOD besides wastewater might be leaves, dead animals, things like that that need oxygen to decompose. Total suspended solids are very fine solids that are still in the water. Our current permit limits are about 10. So you can see what's coming out of here, not good. Blending. So when we introduce blending, it's blending now treated water. We've added filtration and a chemical feed to assist. The water quality gets a little bit better, and we're mixing it with the good quality water, but on occasion, we're still exceeding permit limits. So blending itself on certain occasions doesn't fix the entire problem. And you'll see that flow is about 6 MGD. And if we go back to this one, you can see that I'm losing point. There are places where that's going to be a problem. I lost it, Chris. Too many clicks. I think I got it. This is just an aerial of what we're getting for 18 million. It's not a whole lot in the wastewater treatment plant in its current configuration. This is the final configuration. So this is a new treatment process. We're adding the MBR new treatment all around on the wastewater side, but we're adding capacity. So where we're only pushing 3, maybe 4 million gallons through our primary treatment now, we have the ability to push 12 if we have to. We're not going to be permitted for that on an average daily basis, but we have the ability to do that. What that does is, in our current, wastewater or our I&I problems, the total volume, when you look at those events, we were dealing with, on the worst rainfalls, about 10 to 12 million gallons on a daily. We now have a capacity through the primary treatment that could potentially handle that, and then a different type of filtration. So the concentration of clean water versus what may come out of the stormwater bypass now is much less, and we're able to meet those permit limits by doing that. The caution here is, if the city doesn't continue to improve the I&I situation, and the city grows and we start using up capacity of the plant over time, the concentration of what's coming here that doesn't meet with the blended water, the really good blended water, could potentially become an issue if you don't continue on the I&I program. This is what 95 million gets you at a wastewater treatment plant. This is generally the layout, and I'll go to this schematic. This is what we produce as a facility plan. So one of the public hearings that we have to have for MD&R is our facility plan, and it's an environmental impact hearing, and what it is an opportunity for anyone who questions the environmental impact of the facility plan to come and speak on what we're proposing. Each one of those components of the MBR is called out if you're in. This is just a drone photo of current construction out at the wastewater treatment plant. You can see the filtration and the chemical feeds and the work going on the outfall 002. And this is what will get us out of the AOC in 2025. The AOC specifically tells us that we must eliminate outfall 002, which is what we're doing. It's a direct discharge of non-treated water. It doesn't specify, but it's implied that we still have to meet our water quality standards with the blended water. And that's why the expansion to the wastewater treatment plant is necessary. Now, again, when we open expansion to the wastewater treatment plant, we're also planning for the growth of the city. So that 12 NGD, that capacity that we're asking to be permitted, we've projected growth of the city out over the life of the debt and said this capacity, pending explosive growth or changes in growth patterns, is sufficient to meet the life of the plant and the debt service to fund the plant. The full expansion time frame is December of 2026, and again, this is something we've communicated to MDNR, and they're aware of that intermittent period of if you got the right type of rainfall, there could be a limited quality issue even with the blended water. So they know what we're planning. So the abatement order, we're satisfying that, and the issues that we're having, they're seeing as interim. And what we're implementing will address those, so they're not concerned with those intermittent issues during the project construction. Part of the next steps and the funding, in order to apply for the SRF funds, there's a few things that have to happen. You have to produce for MDNR total project cost. So I have to tell them, in a design build, we call it the guaranteed maximum price. So I have to obtain that through bidding, through our consultant, and then I have to produce it for them. The issue with bidding post-pandemic era is those bids are only good for a certain amount of time. So what we're looking to do is issue a limited notice to proceed, not going past the funds that we already have secured, to get the MBR underway and honor those bid prices, and then a full final notice to proceed once we close on the SRF loan. The other part of SRF is, and the reason for the discussion tonight, when you apply for whatever amount of money that you want, you have to demonstrate that you've done the legislative procedure to implement rates that would fund said debt. So we don't have to implement what I'm showing you today as far as rates go, but we have to show that by the time we finish that plant and close the loan, that we will have those rates, or we have the ability to put those rates in place. We've passed the legislative process. I hit it a little bit, but in overall need, we've secured $95 million already, so I wouldn't call it in the bank, but because it's distributed over our and the state's bank at the moment. $45 million in the Series 2022 bonds. We had $25 million allocated to us in ARPA funds from the state of Missouri that required a 30% match. And then in 2023, the state appropriated through general revenue another $25 million that required a 50% match. The total project cost sits about $145 million. That leaves us with a $50 million deficit current, and that's what we're pursuing in the SRF loan. The SRF program, I kind of spoke to the benefits of it, but the interest is generally 30% of what you would get in the market. Currently, what they're telling us at closing, we can expect about a 2% interest rate, and that's, and Bob, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's about 1.5% of actual interest and 0.5% in administrative fees.
Correct.
That interest rate in the current market saves us about $1 million in debt service annually, and that's material when you're talking about the rate increases, funding another $1 million in debt on an annual basis. So that's really why SRF is the most appealing to us as far as a funding source currently. There's no penalty for early payout, and we're not required, if we apply for $50 million and they approve them, even if we close, it works similar to a construction loan, a drawdown loan. If we identify other funding between the time we close and the time we finish the project in 2026, almost 2027, we don't have to take that $50 million. And there's no penalty there. this is a good handout, and I wanted to include it. We're not going to go through it, but it kind of spells out the SRF process for you. We started this actually not knowing what we would need from them almost 2 years ago, really, probably more than that. And a lot of things have to happen simultaneously. You're going through design of your wastewater treatment plant, your financial modeling, projecting growth, and you're getting in the design construction side of it, 18-month process to design this MBR, and then an 18-month financial process. And what we're trying to do is align those all on the same date. And we got within 2 months. So I feel pretty good about that. It'd be ideal if we closed on the loan and issued the full notice to proceed the next day, right? But that's just not how it's going to align with the process we're working with. And I kind of mentioned this earlier. Part of the SRF application process, we have to do a full financial analysis of the wastewater fund, and then approve the rates necessary to fund the debt service. We're going to submit the application post the approval if council approves that rate structure, and then have an anticipated closing with MDNR for the $50 million on July 1. The hard part about this process and these state processes too, if I know today that I can't close on that loan by September 30th of this year, I have to tell them on March 1st, which is in a few weeks. So that I want to be in next year's process. And coincidentally, we also have to issue that limited notice to proceed to honor our bids before March 1st. So that's lining up nicely, but you have to have a pretty good idea of how the year's going to lay out and the funding that you're going to implement in order to secure it. It's really small, but I think it's a little bit easier read on your handout. But this is the financial analysis that we went through, more of a summary. And there's a few things I want to call out that we did to build the rate structure. And part of that is we look at operations and maintenance costs of the actual treatment plant, the collection system. So we've looked at a new system and all the potential new costs. So it's going to take more power to run this bigger plant. We've tried to forecast that to the best of our ability, and included that in operation and maintenance. We've looked at additional staff. We've looked at increase in wages, and incorporated that into the operation and maintenance expense. So that line 12 is really encompassing a lot of what you see in the wastewater budget. So if you go to the 20, you'll notice that's a lot of lines that are condensed into one: operations and maintenance. We look at the existing debt, the proposed debt. We look at trying to end the year with a 90-day operating reserve, which is just the financial policy that we've adopted as a city. The second part of the financial analysis is the flow of capital funds. So we look at the funding we've secured, the debt that we're going to get, and how that flows out over the life of the project and when the project's complete. We look at other potential capital expenses if we have to replace a vehicle or a pump or a lift station. I'll just tell you that we've done and are doing so much. There's not a lot of other ancillary projects in this 3-year window that we're doing. It's mostly just this expansion. And then one of the main drivers of the rates is really the debt service coverage. So the part of the SRF is that we have to maintain a 1.2 coverage on the debt service. So that drives the rates almost as much as any of the other costs that we're incorporating. Any questions on that? That is a very brief summary of a very detailed financial analysis that went down. And again, if there's questions as we go on to the next meeting, or please feel free to reach out. So out of that financial analysis comes a proposed rate structure. And you'll see that in 25, 26, and 27, there's more substantial rate increases. 28 and 29 are typical 2% cost of inflation projected increases. So really the bulk of what we're talking about is implemented equally over 3 years. And the reason we went at it with that approach is if we find alternative funding, grants or otherwise, we haven't implemented the full rate increase right out the gate. So we just have to have it in place, whatever funding we're going to utilize by 2027. This gives you kind of a depiction of what that means for different bill classes. I would tell you that most of our city falls between, excuse me, I'm running out of juice, falls between the small and medium user. So you can see really the impact of those 3 years of the bulk of the rate increase is somewhere between $6 and $12 a month each year for most ratepayers. And then you can kind of see it's somewhere, you know, in an average user between 55 and 105 as far as a typical bill. What those rates fund, I wanted to break down kind of, you know, where the rates go and how it looks in a total structure of the rates. O&M is about 42% of your rate. The existing debt, 28%. The new debt, 22%. And then future capital and projects on hand about 8% we're funding in those rates. One of the exercises I did, I don't know if it was worthwhile or not, but I went back to 97 and I pulled the wastewater rates. And it was tough to track that through time because at different times in the city's history, the water and wastewater funds were combined. So there was a single rate, and then we pulled it apart. At different times, we've adjusted the base quantity of gallons that are included in the base rate. But generally what I would tell you is if you just adjusted the all of the compliance issue rates for inflation, we would be pretty close to where we are today. And really what we're talking about is new capital that we're funding in 25, 26, and 27. So where we're at today was built on really the way we built the system in 97. On our side for communication and action plan going from these rates forward, continue to pursue additional funding via the state. There are still opportunities out at the state level, both in clean water money, infrastructure money, ARPA, all those things are still on the table and we're continually pursuing those. In August of this year, I would say we'll have a good picture of what we're actually going to probably borrow, at least in this initial allocation, and that's when we'll start the ratepayer awareness of the first actual impact to their bill, which would be about a year from today in 2025. The other options that I think are important to note is that the city could choose to utilize other funding sources for the debt service, one of those being the 2017 SIST expires in 2027. So if it was an option or the council's desire to pursue renewing that tax, you could potentially allocate it to the debt service of the wastewater plant and offset those potential rate increases in 26 or 27 if we went to renew that in 26 or 27. And then I mentioned there's always grant funds, and we have been successful because of the action that we've taken. We've demonstrated that, one, we're going to use the funds, we're going to do the projects we said we're going to do. We'll implement the rates necessary on our side to do what we said we were going to do. But when it comes to ARPA, and there's no certainty to this statement, so I want to be clear about that, but those funds have to be spent by 2026. And I would, from my project delivery hat, I'm going to tell you, if you're not well underway, getting something done by 2026 is a real challenge. So there's a potential reallocation of ARPA, and we are one of the most competitive, I would say, applicants for a reallocation of funds that don't get spent. Next step, so tonight's the first read of the rate ordinance. We have a public hearing on the 20th for both the rates and the environmental. We have a resolution for the council to approve the application to SRF. If all of that is passed, we would submit the application, issue the limited notice to proceed to our contractor to start on the wastewater expansion. And really, that's a procurement of materials. Some of those lead times on electronics, technology for the treatment, it's a year to 18 months on some of it. So it's important to get that going. And then continue from here through the implementation of the rates to discuss funding alternatives. 45 minutes. 30 years, 45 minutes.
One question, MG, that's million gallons, MGD, million gallons
Millions a
daily.
day. Yep, million
Perfect.
gallons a day. Yes, sir.
Does location have any impact on build right now? Because I know it's not the first location that was proposed.
Okay, so I think what I'm answering is, should we abandon wastewater where it's at because it was the wrong place to begin with and go back to the south side of town? And I would tell you, it's not cheaper now today at this point. And the water quality requirements discharging to a Table Rock watershed are much more stringent than our current. There's a whole gambit of law associated with Table Rock Lake. And most of the loading is allocated to other cities. So we would essentially have to discharge reusable clean water from that point.
When we talk just to people, not me, obviously, who understood every detail of that, but just to like other not as smart as me people, what happens outside of government regulation and us getting slapped on the wrist $4,000 at a time? What happens if we just don't build anything? If we just let the stormwater run off? Like, what happens to our area environmentally?
So a couple of things. There's communities around us that are in consent decrees. That would be the technical name of it. But there's a few things. The first thing they're going to do is say, no more people flushing their toilets into your system until you fix it. So that's the first thing. No more buildings, no more growth. That's a piece of it. Then there's the fine. Then they're going to come in and force us to fix it, and then they'll impose the rates necessary to make those improvements.
Gotcha. So it's going to happen.
Yeah.
We can't just not.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's that important of a deal.
What we're proposing provides for the city the ability to continue to grow. The way they would impose it, we're still going to make improvements. It will stifle us, and their improvements will only be to serve what we have today.
Andrew, great job. Going back to the bill comparison from the small user to the large user, is the small user, I'm assuming, residential, and then larger as more of the commercial?
Yeah, I'll get those numbers posted in that because I don't think it's listed here. But we generally do those in, I believe, 2, 4, and 10,000 gallon users. But I will get those numbers posted to this.
Thank you.
On the, you mentioned earlier the standards that can kind of move. I mean, what's the risk of that we're trying to go above the minimum standards, but we do it and then 5 years later they say, okay, now the standard is X.
I would say that the likelihood that quality standards will change are inevitable. What we're doing here, I believe, sets an industry standard for the best in treatment technology that if it can't do it, I don't know what there is that you could feasibly say a city has to build and charge to meet those quality standards. The MBR, in theory, produces reuse quality water, which is not drinking water. I don't want to make it out like that, but reusable for industrial purposes.
I think you're doing fantastic, my son. I mean, awesome. Could not be more proud.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
And then I think you mentioned on the SRF, it's not a lump sum. It's draw as you use
Yeah.
it. So we wouldn't get stuck to, they give us 50 million, we get other sources.
Yeah, they only want to fund, trust me, we could find $50 million of things to do. They only want to fund the projects that are approved. So if they come in under budget, then they're going to fund what the cost was.
And then, I know we have to set the rates to show the debt service for the project through growth, whatever else. Are we able to adjust rates down? Just growth is bigger than what we thought it was going to be, or stuff of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point because I missed talking about that. In the financial forecast, the growth projection that we utilized was conservative, which is typical for us, even on our budgeting side for sales tax. It's foreseeable in the short term we are going to exceed that projection. I would say almost inevitable. Just for levity, the Stone Creek development alone, 500 apartments in the next couple of years represent 500 new. That's much more than the growth I'm projecting. And what I'll say about the rates is we evaluate those every year as part of the budgeting process. So in Missouri, it's required by law that when we adjust those rates, we do a public hearing. But during the budget process, we look at the efficacy of those rates and say, do we need to, if the 2026 increase was 8% and our growth has exceeded, can we back that down to 4%? So we evaluate that as part of the budget process that we put in front of the council and the fees that we implement each year.
How are we doing in Jeff City? Are we making any traction for this session? Do we know yet?
I'll defer to Mr. Cameron.
We're working in the sessions, what I can share with you.
Okay.
As you can see, it's been an interesting session so far.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Nelson? Seeing none, we will close out this meeting. Well done, Mr. Nelson. Thank
you.
you for the
Great job.
information.